Are you ready, Ms. Silo?
We are ready, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Sidimedi? When we broke for lunch, we were at your slide 79. And we had just gone through the agreement concluded by Mr. Singh for Transnet and regiments, and the conditions that he inserted on the document by manuscript. Then we continue then at slide 80, where you express a view that this constituted an irregular and unlawful extension of the regiment scope. Are you there? Thanks. If you may proceed. Your mic is off, please. Thank you.
Correct, Chair.
You may proceed.
All right. What happens thereafter, Chair? This agreement is in February. On the 4th of February 2014, Transnet and Regiment concluded an agreement, or now let's call it an agreement, purporting to extend the scope of the letter of intent that was concluded between Transnet and McKinsey. And the title of this document, or this agreement, is titled Third Addendum for GSM 12/4/0447 for advisory services related to the acquisition of the 1064 locomotives. So that reference, Chair, is a reference that is used for the 1064 locomotive transaction. So even the first LOI that was concluded between Transnet and McKinsey would have had this reference number. So this document, as it says, it's a third addendum to the LOI. We will recall that there was a first and second addendum that was extending the duration of the initial LOI. So this now was titled Third Addendum to extend both the scope and the value of the LOI. The document is contained in volume 7, page 6605.
Yes. So, McKinsey and Transnet conclude an LOI.
Yes.
There's a first addendum in 2013 to that LOI. There's a second addendum. Following the second addendum, there is a contract between Transnet and regiments purporting to transfer, if I may use that term, the functions of Nedbank contemplated in the LOI to regiments. That's the 24th of January, 2014.
That's correct.
Thereafter, you say in terms of page 6605 in volume 7, there is now a third addendum to the original LOI.
Correct.
Okay? You've got that, you may take us through it.
Correct. In this addendum,
Yes.
like I said, the parties there too is McKinsey and Transnet.
Yes.
The essence of this addendum is to increase the scope of the LOI by incorporating the scope of work that was contained in that agreement that you spoke about before the lunch break, the 24 or 23 January 2018 agreement. So
Between regiments
and Transnet. So that scope then finds expression in this document we will now call the third addendum. So that's the first key issue about the third addendum. And as well, it then increased the contract value of the LOI. The chair will recall that the contract value of the letter of intent was 35.2 million. Now, this was now increased to 41.2 million. And the document, the third addendum, let's call it, to the LOI, does indicate that 15 million will be reserved for this additional scope. So in a sense, it mirrors the terms of that 24 January agreement. So that's what this document purports to do. We will later on deal with the effect, if any, of this document.
It's very strange, isn't it, that an agreement between Transnet and regiments purports to extend and increase the scope and the value of an agreement between Transnet and McKinsey. Isn't it? Or do I miss something?
No, we are not missing anything, Chair. It's
Yes.
quite, but along the line, I think maybe the strangeness of that aspect will come
will be
to light.
clarified.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this third addendum on the dates you have provided, which is 4th February 2014, is concluded 3 months after the lapse of the LOI.
Correct. You'll recall that the LOI lapsed on the 30th of November 2013.
Okay?
And
You may
then
proceed.
the next activity is a conclusion. On 21 February 2014, McKinsey signed a master service agreement with Transnet. The Chair will recall that in terms of the LOI, it was envisaged that on expiration of the LOI, or before its expiration for that matter, the parties will conclude a master service agreement. Now, on 21 February, McKinsey then signed a master service agreement contemplated in that LOI, which we have just said now that it had lapsed on 6 December. Transnet countersigned this document on the 11th of August 2014.
So they signed it after more than a year had lapsed since the lapsing of the LOI.
Not a year, because the LOI lapsed.
Well, your
No, the
page
slide-
82 says it lapsed on 6 December 2012.
No, he
and
said the lapsed
McKinsey-
LOI dated.
Hmm?
No. The slide says the lapsed LOI dated 6 December.
Oh, okay.
6 December is a date of the
Yes.
LOI. But the
How
LOI,
much was the period after it had lapsed?
I beg your pardon, Chair?
How much was the period that had lapsed between the lapsing of the LOI and the signing of this agreement between McKinsey and Transnet relating to the master service agreement?
That round off will be 3 months, but to be precise, it will
Yeah.
be 2 months and
And some
20
weeks.
days.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Yes.
So all of this MSA did, it simply recorded the terms of the LOI dated 6 December, including the fact that the value of this agreement is 35.2 million. And as well, it records that this agreement will lapse on 31st March 2015.
So Transnet then, signing on the 11th of August 2014 as it did, signed after that very agreement itself had expired.
Correct. As you
Okay.
can, if you look at the signatures appearing on page 6632 of the document.
Okay?
But curious enough, the MSA was silent, that is this one, was silent on that agreement that was concluded between Transnet and regiments on 23 January. And as well, it does not make any reference to the third addendum that was concluded 2 weeks earlier, being the third addendum, or a document purporting to be a third addendum to the LOI concluded between regiments and Transnet. It makes no reference to those two documents.
Was that date of 31 March 2014 deliberate, intentional, as the date recorded as the expiry date of the MSA? So does this mean that the MSA's life was about just over a month?
The commencement date
Is 21 February 2014 according to, or at least your slide says 21 February 2014 is when it was signed.
That's when it was signed
it
by-
may be that the commencement date is defined differently.
correct. So it was important for, we must reflect the different dates. The chair is quite correct. On the actual document, it says commencement date is 15 January 2013, but it is signed 21 February. If the chair can have regard to page 6332, it was signed by Mackenzie. There's a table there that indicates the signatories to the document.
Yes.
On the right, that's for and on behalf of Mackenzie, signed by Mr. David Fine. That's 21 February 2014. And then on behalf of Transnet is Mr. Anuj Singh on the 11th of August.
So the ones, the Mackenzie signed it on the 21st February 2014, and Transnet signed it a number of months thereafter on 11 August 2014.
From the look of things.
And it was said to be, the commencement date was said to be what date? Is that
15,
in the definition section?
15 January 2013.
Where do I find that?
That is on page 6609. The front page of the document, of the agreement.
Oh, okay. Is that all that they did? Put the commencement date there on the cover page and did not include it in the definition section, or did they do that as well?
On the definition section appearing on page 6611, paragraph 2.5, the commencement date means 5 January, notwithstanding the signature date of this agreement.
Please indicate the full date.
5 January 2013.
Thank you. Your mic, Chair.
There had been no agreement for the best part of this period, but the agreement was signed much later, and then they say it would start much earlier. Yeah, okay.
And just to check, Mr. Sidumedi, have you had opportunity to compare the terms of the LOI with this agreement?
We have definitely the terms of the law. We did compare the two.
And is it so that the MSA reflects to a large extent the LOI? It's not in conflict therewith? save in this respect the period of the agreement itself.
Correct. Chair will recall that in terms of the LOI, the duration of the relationship was a 9-month period. And in the event that the services go beyond 9 months, then that will be at no cost to Transnet. So to an extent that this agreement, at least its expiry date goes beyond 9 months from January, that will be in conflict with what the letter of intent had specified on 6 December 2012.
Okay. All right. So now we have the MOI, which we know was due to expire on the 31st March 2014.
Correct.
The Master Services Agreement, I apologize, MSA.
That's correct.
You can take it from there.
Now, the next milestone, if I can use that word.
Well, before you go to it, of course, this thing of signing an agreement today and saying its commencement date is sometime last year is just a physical impossibility. This is something you might not be able to comment on because but I'm wondering whether, as you were appointed to investigate, you sought to investigate why it was necessary to have an agreement that sought to do the impossible.
In the next slide.
What was sought to be the value for Transnet?
If I can posit a view, maybe it might be simply to record the terms of the LOI, but for what purpose, I'm not quite sure, because in any event, the LOI had lapsed. It is not like this MSA came before the lapsing. It was something else, maybe it came before the lapsing, but the fact that it came after, the fact 3 months after its expiration, one would not understand the rationale. I am aware, though, Chair, because based on and this was not part of this happened in the past few weeks. We have received correspondence from, I think it was Norton Rose. I think that they are the legal representatives of Mackenzie, to say that was just to record what was supposed to have been recorded already before in terms of the LOI. So it's more of a regularization. That's just my interpretation of how they envisaged this issue. So that's the explanation that we got in the last few weeks as we're engaging on this matter.
Well, it would be important to find out what those, particularly from the side of Transnet, who agreed to such a thing, what they sought to achieve for Transnet. Because if there's something that was supposed to have been done and wasn't done, if they acted transparently, all they needed to do is to record that the following things were supposed to have been done and they were not done, or the following things were done. They should have been done after the agreement had been concluded, but were done without an agreement, and they are hereby, by agreement between the parties, accepted to be, they must be dealt with as if the agreement was in existence at that time, if it's something transparent. But when you say you sign an agreement today and you say its commencement date is a year ago, it's very, very strange. I mean, when both parties were conducting themselves in a certain way during that time, they didn't have any contractual obligations. So when can you say they were in breach of this agreement that didn't exist? What purpose does it serve? It just makes you wonder whether there is something hidden that it was supposed to cover, but okay, all right.
Thank you, Chair. We then go on to the next slide. Mr. Sidumedi, your slide 83.
83.
Yes, Chair.
Now, on 16 April 2014, McKinsey addressed a letter to Transnet advising that it had ceded its advisory rights and obligations to regiments on 5 February 2014.
And the rights and obligations being sought to be ceded arise from which document or which contract?
It could only be the rights and obligations in terms of the letter of intent.
So would the following be a correct understanding of that letter? Transnet is advised, albeit on the 16th of April 2014, that as early as the 5th of February 2014, Mackenzie had ceded all its rights and obligations to regiments arising from the LOI. Notwithstanding such session, on the 14th of March, Mackenzie concludes an MSA deriving from the same LOI with Transnet, and regiments doesn't feature there as a cedent.
That's what seems to be the case on this one.
Okay.
I know it does not, legally speaking, does not make sense, but at least
But that's a correct understanding on
that
our
is
part if we take.
that is a correct understanding of what that letter says.
Okay.
Which then, the following week, or so on the 24th of April, Transnet and regiments conclude a first addendum to the master service agreement. The purpose of that addendum, amongst others, was to vary the MSA, to add additional scope, and as well amend the price that was in the MSA. The chair will recall that the MSA that we refer to just embodied the terms of the LOI concluded in December. So this document, the first addendum, then sought to amend that document by, amongst others, and in terms of the scope, it says the scope was varied by the additional scope, such as to assist Transnet on negotiations on accelerated delivery of the 1064 locomotives, compute the effects of hedging and escalation, optimize and reduce foreign exchange hedge costs. And the value of the contract, you'll recall that the LOI and the MSA was 35.2. Then this, it's been increased to 78.4 million.
Again, so we don't get our dates mixed up. We know the MSA tells us at the front page that the commencement date is 15 January 2013 and the expiry date is 31st March 2014.
Okay.
The addendum you refer to as the first addendum to the MSA is concluded 24th April 2014, 3 weeks after, on the terms of the MSA itself, the MSA has expired.
Correct.
And that first addendum now is concluded between Transnet and regiments and no longer Mackenzie.
Correct.
We follow? May I continue?
Then on 16 July 2015, Transnet and regiments concluded a second addendum to the MSA. And the essence of that MSA, to summarize, again, it was to amend the scope of service, to change the remuneration model, and as well to extend the duration of the MSA. Amongst the services that were now included in varying the original terms was to provide technical support, including the building cost escalation models and total cost of ownerships, to develop a detailed funding plan for the acquisition of the 1064 locomotive from GE, Bombardier, CNR, and in a sense from the 4 OEMs. We will provide a funding plan on how you'll fund the acquisition of the locomotives from the 4 OEMs. The value was then increased to an amount not exceeding 265,500,000. That's the cap. And as well, the contract was now extended to 18 May 2016 until such time that Transnet notifies regiments that its deliverables have been successfully completed.
And that could presumably take 10 years? 2, 5, if you pick?
Whichever comes first, as
Okay.
they correct.
And now, again, I go back. We are now in the original LOI/MSA, read them together. The original contract amount is 35 million.
Correct.
The first addendum to the MSA increases that value to 78 million.
Correct.
And that happens April 2014.
Correct.
July 2015, that 78 further increases to a figure not exceeding 265 million.
Correct.
That is now the latest contract value.
That's the latest contract value.
Okay. Please continue.
Now, in this slide, then we then bring all these agreements together to see, from a legal point of view, whether is there any sense that one can make of the agreements. We then started with the third addendum to the LOI, or the purported third addendum dated 4 February. Our conclusion was that the LOI had already lapsed on 13 November 2013. That's the first issue. So any attempt by anyone to extend the LOI is an attempt to do the impossible. Second, regiments was not even a party to the LOI, because that LOI was between Transnet and McKinsey.
Yes.
So even if it had not lapsed, it was impossible for regiments in any event to conclude this agreement because they were not a party to that LOI. So that's the first issue that we address with the third addendum. We then looked at, because you'll recall that there's a letter that we got, that Transnet got on the 16th of April, being advised that there was a session that occurred on the 5th of February. We have not been able to locate, despite numerous searches and inquiries, we could not locate this session. Now, again, even if McKinsey ceded, as the letter suggests, there was nothing to cede, because the LOI, whatever rights that they had, they ceased to exist at least on the morning of the 1st of November 2013.
1st December 2013.
Yes.
Yes.
So it was legally and practically impossible to cede rights that do not exist. We looked at the MSA that was concluded on the 21st of February. That MSA as well suffers the very same fate that the preceding document suffered, in a sense that the LOI lapsed on the 30th of November. And besides, on the 21st of February, Ms. Kenzie had already ceded his rights on the 5th of February. or in favor of regiments. So it could not have concluded this MSA because it did not have any rights, notwithstanding the fact that the LOI had not lapsed, but they had already on their own version ceded the rights in terms of the LOI to regiments on the 5th of February.
Mm-hmm.
The first addendum between Transnet and regiments, the 24 April addendum, same issue. The first addendum to the MSA derives its existence from an invalid MSA. So if the MSA is invalid, it goes without saying that even this first addendum as well is invalid. And in any event, regiments was not a party to that MSA because the session that they made reference to on the 5th of February occurred when the LOI had already lapsed. A similar fate bedevils the second addendum to the MSA between regiments and Transnet for the same reasons that we have used for the previous ones equally apply to this second addendum.
Yes.
So that is insofar as the fate of these agreements come to.
Okay. You may continue. We follow.
Now, in the next slide, we then said, that was now insofar as the agreements are concerned. We then try to, on a left column, put up all these agreements and attempt to compare them with the payments that we know Transnet paid to both Mackenzie and regiments. By 30 November 2013, I did testify already that Mackenzie was already paid an amount of 11,003,000 rand. So at least we can safely say these payments arose as a result of the LOI and their respective, at least the first two addenda.
Mm-hmm.
We then pick up, when you analyze the spreadsheets, because this came from, we analyzed the invoices that were submitted to Transnet and appearing on the payment records of Transnet for these periods. We are not necessarily attaching these payments to these agreements, but are simply saying these payments seem to have occurred at least during the period of the purported existence of these agreements. Between 18 February 2014 and 7 April 2014, regiments was already paid an amount of 36,765,000 rand, at least by 7th of April. As well, during the period of the first addendum, there was a payment of 79,230,000, because it was an invoice that regiments raised on the 27th of March for services that have already rendered. Lastly, the second addendum, that period, we know that regiments raised an invoice in March, which was paid in June, on the 11th of June 2015, that was 6 March 2015, for an amount of 189,240,000. So those are the payments that we could group in relation to the agreements that we have analyzed.
But what you point out to the chair is, notwithstanding how you present this information, we should not understand the payments to regiments, the respective payments, to derive from the contracts that are placed next to the payment.
Correct.
All you try to do is you highlight the dates on which certain contracts came into being, purportedly,
Correct.
and you consider in that period whether regiments was paid,
Correct.
and you determine that.
Correct.
But we can't go so far as to say that they claim the 36 million on the basis of the third addendum or the MSA.
Correct.
We understand. Yes, you may continue.
And this speaks to, this slide speaks to the payment of 79,208,000.
That's your pay, slide 87.
Slide 87.
Yes.
You recall earlier when you put up the table of the amounts in the letter of intent,
Yes.
and the MSA, albeit concluded a year later, those two documents allocated an amount of 13.5 million for the technical evaluation and execution services. So this, in a sense, was the assistance or advisory service that was going to be provided to Transnet in the evaluation of the bids that were received and the ultimate conclusion of the locomotive supply agreements with the 4 OEMs. Now, on the 16th of April 2014, there's a memorandum prepared by Mr. Anuj Singh to the then Group Chief Executive, Mr. Brian Molefe, requesting approval of an amount of 78.4 million, excluding VAT, as a success fee to regiments, on a basis that regiments, as part of their scope in assisting in the evaluation of the bids, they achieved some savings for Transnet. So on that basis, regiments ought to be paid an amount of 78.4 million for that work. And we now know that on the 17th of April, that memorandum was approved. This approval, in actual fact, that culminated in the signing of the first addendum to the MSA, where the amount of 79 million was paid. The view that we held and still hold is that this approval of this amount was irregular because the LOI, when the McKinsey Consortium won the bid, there was a specific allocation for this very service that regiment had just provided, and the amount that was allocated for that service was 13.5 million. So it can't be that now there must be a memorandum that purports or creates an impression that as a result of regiment's intervention on a work that in any event was awarded to the consortium and budgeted for, that regiment must now be paid 78.4 million.
Now this memo you speak of, you say it emanated from this then Group CFO, Mr. Singh, to Mr. Molefe. In that memorandum, does Mr. Singh support payment of this 78 million? Does he argue for its payment?
Yes, he does argue for the payment of this amount.
Does he make reference to any document presumably emanating from regiments as to how that amount of 78 million was arrived at and how it directly, how that whatever particular service directly resulted in the savings that is claimed?
In that memorandum, we know when we conducted our investigations that there was actually a proposal coming from regiments where they were motivating that due to the hard work that they have conducted as part of assisting Transnet in the evaluation, they obtained some savings for Transnet, and as a result of that saving, they were motivating that they must be paid a success fee for that service. So that we picked up that document was coming initially from regiments. It was for a higher figure, but we know that when the memorandum was prepared, it was for this figure, by the very same reasoning that was advanced by regiments in their letter were captured in this specific memorandum.
Now, do either document speak to the original 13.5 budgeted amount for the very same service? So is this a payment of 78 over and above the 13.5, or is the 13.5 now included in the 78? Do any of the two documents speak to this issue?
From my recollection, Chair, I don't have the document in front of me now, but the 78.4 was not a top-up from the look of things. This was now just a self-standing amount that is supposed to be paid to regiments.
Okay. May I proceed?
So that's...
Well, that's 78.4 is not 78, around 78.4 million.
It is 78 million
Comma 4.
400,000.
Yes.
78.4 million.
Yeah, your slide doesn't have, it just has 78 comma
78
rand
78.4 million.
million.
There
Yeah.
isn't. Is
Yes.
there on the project it says in 8.4?
Oh, well,
The 4 is very
one,
close to the
the one
end.
on the hard copy at page 87.
The
I
last
think
bullet
that one
point.
has got a million on the screen.
Yes,
This one doesn't have on the hard copy.
that's correct, Chair.
Yeah.
The last bullet point, reference to 78.4, the last bullet on the hard copy doesn't have the M, indicating
Yes.
that it's in millions.
Correct. Yeah, because that was changed.
That was subsequently corrected.
Correct.
Okay. Okay.
When I
Thank you,
became
Chair.
wiser on figures.
Yes.
Okay. Please proceed.
On the slide, Chair, is just to reiterate the point that we made earlier when we looked at the, to explain to the Chair that the differences between volume 2A and 2B, to say there will be a witness that will in detail now analyze some of these transactions, including this very same 78.4. But the point that the overall point that we make is that, and that will also be demonstrated when that witness testifies, that there was just no legal basis for Transnet to conclude an agreement to pay regiments on any other figure that was not provided for in the MSA, or at least even the LOI when it was still alive. And that work is contained in volume 2B, and the testimony will be led Friday morning.
Were there common personalities on the part of Transnet that were involved in all of these addenda and agreements?
Yes, sir, on this one, I think one can safely say, I know as a matter of fact that Mr. Anoj Singh was there. On Mr. Gama was around. There's a Mr. Petula Ramusibudi, the head of Treasury, but he came just shortly after the conclusion of the first 79 million, but this specific one, I know he was involved and was quite appraised of the previous memorandum. So those are the two that come to mind, if I remember.
To the extent that this might not have been covered, it would be important to see who signed on each one of the agreements and the addenda. And apart from just signing, if possible, to see who was otherwise involved in the negotiations of these agreements and addenda, even if they didn't sign from Transnet side. Obviously, it would be important also to see from either McKinsey's side or Regiment's side for what it's worth, but particularly from Transnet, it might be important to see who signed and who was involved in the negotiations or discussions apart from those who signed.
Chair, I believe that the first question can be immediately answered.
Yes.
With reference to, and Mr. Sidumedi can check whether I'm correct. It would appear from the LOI, the first addendum to the LOI and the second addendum to the LOI, all were signed on behalf of Transnet by Mr. Anuj Singh.
Correct.
It would also appear from the records as well, the agreement went through between Transnet and Regiments of January 2014.
Yes.
That was signed by Mr. Anuj Singh on behalf of Transnet.
Correct.
So too was the MSA concluded between Transnet and McKinsey in March of 2014. It was likewise signed by Mr. Anuj Singh.
That's correct.
And the third alleged addendum to the LOI signed between Regiments and Transnet was once again signed by Mr. Anuj Singh for Transnet. And the last two addenda to the MSA now, concluded between Transnet and Regiments, were signed on behalf of Transnet by Mr. Anuj Singh.
That's correct.
Am I correct?
That's correct, yeah.
So at least that Mr. Anuj Singh's signature appears in all of them.
Common in all
It is
of
a
them.
question of, are there any other signatures
Yes.
that are appearing?
Yes, and are there any other Transnet people that were involved in the discussions or negotiations, even if they did not sign?
Chair, may I make a correction? My junior points out to me that, in fact, the first addendum between Mackenzie and Transnet, I indicated was signed by Mr. Anuj Singh for Transnet. No, it appears at page 6582 to have been signed by Mr. Gary Peter.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. But we will prepare a full list based on the documentation made available to us, indicating who signed on behalf of Transnet and whether there were any witnesses to such signatures.
Yes,
And then that would then go to answering the next question that the Chair had posed.
yeah.
Because I think over and above the agreements, we must look at the various memoranda,
Yes,
how to prepare it internally,
yes.
which are approved or motivated for the conclusion of these transactions.
We will do so, Chair, and revert. Thank you. You may continue, Mr. Sidumedi.
Right. This on slide 89 speaks about on volume 4, page 5579. It's a memorandum dated 28 April 2015 by Mr. Siabonga Gama, addressed to the Board Acquisition and Disposal Committee, requesting an approval to confine an appointment of J.P. Morgan to hedge the financial risks arising out of the 1064 transaction. Secondly,
Sorry, just to clarify, we're finished on the topic now of the LOIs and the MSA.
My
We've now
apologies.
changed topics. We are now talking about J.P. Morgan and Trillion and the appointment
correct,
of each. Okay.
correct. My apologies for not
Thank you.
concluding properly on that topic.
Thanks.
So in this memorandum, Mr. Gama requests approval that J.P. Morgan must be appointed to hedge the financial risks. That's the first assignment. The second assignment is for J.P. Morgan to lead, arrange, and underwrite the ZA syndicated club loan. And you'll hear more about the club loan on Friday, but in essence, it was a syndication of various lenders for them to combine and provide the loan, because individually, obviously, they could not chew the big amount that was requested, so various lenders then consolidated their efforts. Each one contributed a specific amount. That's why it's called a club loan. It's a club of lenders. So obviously then you will need a lead arranger to coordinate and ensure that all these participants are able to or synchronize their terms and conditions. So those are the two mandates that Mr. Gama sought approval for. And as well, that very same memorandum as well increased the extension of contract for regiments from 99.5 million to 265.5 million. But for now, nothing turns on this specific third bullet. The focus is about the two bullets above. Confinement for hedging and lead arranging, two separate mandates.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed, on 29 April, the BADC considered the matter, and JP Morgan was only appointed to hedge the financial risks, not the second. So, and as well, for record purposes, it also confirmed this extension of contract for regiments. From the reading of the minutes, there is no indication whatsoever that the BADC ever considered the other second request to appoint JP Morgan to lead and arrange the club loan as requested. But it confirms that JP Morgan can be appointed to hedge the financial risks.
Okay.
Now, that is what it is. However, 5 months after that appointment, on the 17th of September, Mr. Gama prepares another memorandum requesting the BADC to approve the substitution of JP Morgan by a company called Trillion Asset Managers for the lead arranger role for the club loan. Chair will recall that you had said that the BADC never, or JP Morgan, at least from the approval of the BADC, never had the mandate to perform the lead arranger role. However, this memorandum now requests that Trillion must replace JP Morgan on that role. And
did you say that, I'm sorry, did you say that you had regard to the minutes of the BADC meeting and there is nothing reflected in those minutes that indicates that they considered this part of the request?
Correct. The minutes appear on volume 4, page 5515 of the record.
Yes.
All right?
Yes.
So that memo indeed was approved on 1 October, where Trillion replaced JP Morgan for the lead arranger role in the ZA club loan. So it was our finding that the entry of Trillion into the system was irregular in a sense that that function was never assigned to JP Morgan in the very first place. So it could not have been that then Trillion could then step into the shoes of JP Morgan to lead and arrange the ZA club loan. And for that service, Trillion was paid an amount of 93 million rands.
Did the resolution of the BD,
The
or the
ADC.
APADC, did the resolution also say nothing about this part?
It was quiet, Chair. We can refer to,
Mr. Sidumedi, perhaps let's take it in turn, Chair. Unfortunately, for that, we're going to have to make you pull out volume 4.
You don't have to deal with it now if you want to deal with it later. I just wanted to have an idea because you said from the minutes it doesn't appear that that committee considered, and I wondered whether they might have resolved without considering. So
It's opposite to consider the documents now, Chair. This is the right
yeah,
time.
No, that's
Yes.
fine. Yeah.
So, and for that, we need to go to volume 4, Chair, if I may
Okay.
request you to pull it out.
Okay. Am I still going to need volume 7? Volume
No,
1?
Chair, we're done with volume 7.
Volume 1?
We need, volume 4 is our last volume,
Only volume 4.
only volume 4, Chair.
What page?
Let's start with the memorandum by Mr. Gama to Bedek, that is at 5579.
okay?
Is that the memorandum you referred to, Mr. Sidumedi?
Correct. Dated 28 April 2015.
Okay,
It's addressed to the Acquisition Disposal Committee from Mr. Siabonga Gama.
yes,
The purpose of the submission is to request the Acquisitions and Disposals Committee to, 1, approve the confined appointment of J.P. Morgan to hedge the financial risks emanating from the 1.5 billion US dollar CDB loan back into ZAR, South African rands. 2, approve the confined appointment of J.P. Morgan to lead and underwrite the equivalent syndicated ZAR loan of $1.5 billion.
yes.
So those were the 2 approvals that were sought by this memorandum.
Before you leave that page, there's a third one regarding regiments now.
Okay, that's the one that we spoke about earlier on. To approve the contract extension from 99.5 million to 265.5 million for the appointment of regiments for transaction advisory services and support to Transnet on the 1064 locomotive transaction. You'll recall, Chair, we spoke of the second, no, that's not the one. Let me just ignore that one, yeah. So that one doesn't appear. So this is the approvals that were then sought by Mr. Gama from the BADC.
Yes,
And then, if you look at volume 4, page 5515, that is the resolution. No, not this one. My apologies, the 5515. I had the wrong document. Paragraph 5.4.
before you say, let's just confirm what that document is.
This document
Is a resolution of the,
it's a certified excerpt from minutes of the meeting of the Acquisitions and Disposal Committee held on 29 April 2015. And item 5.4,
yes,
management distributed the documentation in the meeting This will be that memorandum that we spoke about earlier.
Yes.
The documentation was taken as read. The purpose of the submission was to request the committee to approve the following: the confinement appointment of JP Morgan to hedge the financial risks emanating from the US, the 1.5 billion US dollars. The contract extension for the appointment of regiments for transaction advisory services and support to the company on the 1064 locomotive transaction from 99 million to 25 million. You'll note from this, Chair, that the only reference that the minutes refer to is the hedging component, not that second element that I spoke about regarding the lead arrangement. And this, if you look at the resolution then, that appears on the next page. How BDEC then resolved on this matter. Resolved that the committee approved the following: the confined appointment of JP Morgan to hedge the financial risks emanating from the 1.5 billion US dollar CDB loan into South African rands. And as well, to complete the point, to the contract extension for the appointment of regiments for transaction advisory services and support the company on the 1064 locomotive. And as well, that the delegation of authority to the acting GCE to approve the documentation relating to the confined process.
Okay.
So that's what the PADC resolved on this issue, which is why we had said in our point that a review of these minutes indicate that there was no consideration of that request to lead arrange, which is why it becomes strange that on 1 October, the very same PADC, or at least before the PADC, there's a memorandum that is prepared by Mr. Gama requesting a substitution of JP Morgan for this, with regiments for this service, and that is then subsequently approved by BDEC.
Trillion, not regiments.
Did you get to know whether the agenda or whether the supporting documents that were actually placed before the BADC committee included this part that was not reflected in the resolution? Did it reach that point? Was it ever before them? Do you know about that?
Chair,
or whether what was ultimately before them might not have included that part?
from the look of things, Chair, look, this specific one, we know it was signed off by all the relevant parties that are required to sign, and the next activity from the 28th is the actual sitting of this meeting. There's no other meeting of BDEC. So the only issue pertaining to JP Morgan would have been entertained at this specific meeting. What we are obviously not privy to is whether maybe either in the morning of the meeting, maybe that component would have been withdrawn. That's not, but the point that we wanted to advance was simply to say the subsequent appointment of Trillion purporting to replace JP Morgan cannot be correct because there was never any approval of that specific item. That's the point that we...
No, I understand that point. I'm going beyond that. Because you said the minutes don't reflect that the committee ever discussed that component. What I'm wondering is whether when the committee was considering this issue, what was before them included that component or not, because if it did include them, if what was before them did include that component, one could definitely look through them to say what happened to that component. But if one doesn't know whether that component did reach them, that might be a different issue. Now, the memorandum that had been prepared did include it, but the question is whether we know that that memorandum served before the committee as we see it.
As you see it.
Yeah.
I think that's something.
Although, Chair, I must say the minute of BEDEC, at the opening page of that, it quotes verbatim what is set out under purpose in the memorandum. So it repeats precisely what is being sought to be approved. And that reads exactly the same way as the memorandum reads.
Okay.
But that, however, doesn't answer the question whether the memorandum itself physically served before or whether it was quoted from. But
Yes,
we know that the minute does record the 3 specific approvals that were being sought at that meeting.
Well, no, that does help.
Yes.
In the sense that if the minutes reflect that,
Yes, Chair.
what it means is that the committee, at least at a certain stage of the meeting, was aware
Indeed, Chair.
that, among other things, they were required to approve that component as well.
In fact, Chair,
And then we see when we look at the resolution that it's not there.
indeed, Chair. When we look at page 5515, volume 4, that is the excerpt of the minute. At 5515, it starts off precisely with the approvals being sought from the committee.
Yes,
At 5516,
Yes.
it then lists the resolutions taken by the committee.
yes.
And the resolutions exclude one of the
Yes.
requested approvals being in respect of the appointment of a lead arranger.
Yes.
Yes.
Did you receive comments from those concerned to this criticism on your part of how this issue was handled? And what were their comments as to how they could have regiments take the place of J.P. Morgan in regard to an issue that had never been approved by the committee?
Chair, by the time we completed this portion of our investigation, Mr. Gama was no longer part of Transnet, so we could not equip him on this aspect. But I know when we interviewed Mr. Petula Ramusibudi, because he was a compiler of this document, as it appears on the memorandum, he could not provide a coherent answer on this issue because there were other queries that we raised that were not making any sense, including the subsequent memorandum to appoint Trillion to substitute J.P. Morgan. We were hoping that at this disciplinary hearing he was going to be able to answer that, but when he received a letter intending to suspend him, he resigned from Transnet.
And you didn't try to get any answers from members of the BADC, that committee, BADC?
No, the BADC members, because remember BADC is comprised of board members.
Yes, no, I
So
accept that.
we did not,
Yes.
you recall if the modus operandi of investigation was
Yes.
internally focused?
It's
something
that part of it is regrettable because some of those people would not, I assume, I'm sure there would have been some who would have been quite happy to cooperate and give answers, and those answers could have been helpful, to say, how come, what happened here? And they might have been able to say, well, as among ourselves, as members of the committee, here are some of the things that were happening, and so on and so on. So that part is regrettable.
Chair, perhaps not, because that's a role that can be played by this commission.
Correct.
Well-
MNS assists us insofar as it managed to do investigations up to a certain point. Any
Well,
gaps that...
No. If I was in charge of Transnet and I paid money for people to investigate, I wouldn't want them to investigate and not interview people who could have important information, because sometime later a commission might look into that.
No,
I
Chair,
would want them
it's-
I would want them to do their best, interview those people. If they refuse and they don't have power to force them, that's another story.
Indeed, Chair.
But all those that are happy to assist because maybe they were not party to any agendas, should be interviewed. I want to know what they know.
No, Chair, I absolutely agree. I don't take issue with that. I was just saying, when the Chair says it's regrettable, my point was, as far as the commission is concerned, not all is lost yet.
No,
because
that
the commission
I
can
accept.
still do that.
No, that I accept. It's just that if they had been able to do that, we might not have had to do that, because we might have answers already.
But Chair, you'll recall that this is a legal analysis. The documents as they stand, they speak for themselves, right? It is clear whether there's a view that a PDEC member had that no, we didn't think JP Morgan was worthy of, is immaterial. The point is, JP Morgan was appointed for item 1. So therefore, it is impossible for anybody to substitute item 2, which Morgan never had in the very first place. So the documents, in our view, they spoke for themselves to be able to
I don't think
reach.
that would have satisfied me, and I don't think that Transnet authorities should be satisfied with that. Actually, the fact that that happened should want Transnet authorities to want to understand how did it happen. What was the role of various members of the committee? Were there elements within the committee who were pushing a certain agenda or not? And you can't know that without talking to people. You see, documents are not going to tell you everything. So that's my point. And there may be people who were members of that committee who might say to you, if you approach them as an investigator, I will tell you what happened. So-and-so was saying this or saying this. We were being put under pressure by so-and-so and so-and-so. You get that information. That's useful information for Transnet authorities. That's useful information for us as taxpayers. Okay, all right.
Point taken, Chair.
Okay. But as I said, to the extent that people might not have cooperated and you didn't have power to force them, that's understandable. The part that I'm saying regrettable is not trying. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Point taken, Chair.
So then, getting to your last point, the substitution of Trillian in the lead arranger role,
Correct.
you expressed the view that JP Morgan was never appointed in the first place in that role, so therefore Trillian could not
have
replace
replaced
it.
JP Morgan for that function, and we know they were actually paid an amount of, that is Trillian, they were paid an amount of 93 million for lead arranging in the Zaxo. The reason that phrase, lead arranger, is in quotes is that you will hear in the later testimony that in actual fact, that service was never rendered by Trillian. It was performed by regiments. The documents that we reviewed indicate that that was a function that was actually performed by regiments, not even Trillian. And that's part of litigation that Transnet has instituted against Trillian to recover this amount. And as well, there's litigation between trillion engagements where they are having a dispute over this function, because the regiment correctly so indicates that they have performed this service. That's why the lead arranger was put in quotes for that purpose.
You may continue.
And that, Chair, will be the conclusion of my testimony.
No, thank you very much. If a need arises, you will be asked to come back. But thank you very much for your evidence.
Thank you, Chair.
Before you excuse Mr. Sidumedi, two things. First is, the Chair had posed certain questions to Mr. Sidumedi yesterday regarding, in particular, Ms. Tsepe's attendance at the BEDEC meeting.
Yes, yes.
And regarding the question of delegation of authority, whether, firstly, Mr. Gama had the authority to change the evaluation criteria, and secondly, whether Mr. Gianni had the power and authority to authorize the payment of 1.3 billion to CSR. Mr. Sidumedi has found certain documentation and has prepared a statement he must still sign, and we shall submit. That is a small bundle together with supporting documentation.
Yes.
I think it is self-explanatory and will not require Mr. Sidumedi's presence in the witness box. With your permission, Chair, we may do so.
Yes. Will it be an affidavit or just a statement?
Just a statement currently.
Yes. Well,
Unless the Chair has
I don't know
a
what the
preference.
contents is, but if it is an affidavit and there is nothing controversial, he won't need to come back and testify about it really. But if it is a statement that is not an affidavit and it remains as a statement, that might not have the right status. So preferably it should be an affidavit, but it just depends on its
On the
contents.
content.
If I'll let you exercise your judgment
Thank you,
in terms
Chair,
of
we
its
shall.
contents. It may be a statement and still be just as fine. I just don't know until I see.
We'll reapply our minds
Yeah.
to it and see what works best, Chair,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then we shall revert.
Yeah.
Secondly, Mr. Sidumedi, you have testified as to certain aspects of the MNS investigation.
Correct, Chair.
Could you advise the Chair how MNS proposes to take the rest of the outstanding issues forward?
Okay. The Chair would recall that we have regard to slide 62, so it must not go too far back. It's just, it indicates, it's a diagram indicating the various transactions that we investigated. My testimony touched on 95, 100, some parts of 1064. I also touched a little bit on the procurement of transaction advisors. But on 95, sorry, on 100 and 1064, I did not elaborate much on the reasons that were advanced for the increase in the ETC, because even on 100, there was an increase in the ETC. So Mr. Alistair Chabi will come and testify about that aspect. Secondly, the issue of the relocation of the two OEMs to Durban. A colleague, Mr. Tobani Miando, who's the director at the firm focusing on construction engineering law, will come and testify about that. Lastly, on Friday, Dr. Jonathan Bloom will then unpack the various transactions that were concluded by Transnet on the advice of the transaction advisor. So that will be the evidence that will be led by MNS on those 2 days.
Okay, thank you.
And lastly, Chair, the Chair will recall that yesterday, Mr. Sidumedi indicated that they have a list of people they have interviewed in the course of investigations on these transactions. Chair, if I may,
About 20, yeah? Oh, I think
If there are-
that's what you said, I think, yeah.
may I inquire, Chair, if somebody managed to slip the following into your bundle while the Chair was probably not aware?
I
In
haven't seen
Exhibit
anything.
double B8A, A, after the thank you page, is there no document in the Chair's?
After?
The thank you page of Mr. Sudumedi's slide presentation.
No, not that I have seen.
And that, the thank you page is at slide 92.
Let me see. No, they didn't follow your instructions.
Clearly not, Chair,
Yeah.
but I confirm that a list has been provided and
Yes.
your 888B8A shall be updated accordingly.
Yes. By the way, in regard to each one of those 20 or so people that you interviewed, there will be a transcript of the interview.
Correct, Chair, I can confirm that. In actual fact, by
Yes.
last night when I left the office,
Yes.
the colleagues were already photocopying
Okay.
all the transcripts. So we
okay.
hope that
Okay. That will be very helpful. And basically, the transcripts to take the place of statements, or there will also be additional, there will be statements from each one of them, or just the
No.
transcript of interviews.
those were the transcripts of the
Of
interviews
the
and
interviews.
professionally transcribed
Yes,
by
okay.
those who
Okay.
are qualified to transcribe.
Yes, okay, no, that's fine.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. You are excused.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Chair, as the Chair indicated yesterday, we are running till 5 today, PM.
Yes,
The next witness is ready,
yes.
and I think yesterday the Chair took a 10-minute break at 3:30. I see it is now 3:25. May I request that we take that break now? That would allow for a changing of the guard. We need to set up the next witness because he also
Yes.
is working off slides. And we will couple that with a comfort break, and we might be back at 4 and run until 5, if that would suit the Chair.
Yes, okay. No, let's take a 10 minutes break then,
Okay, Chair.
and we'll resume at, did you say, no, it will be 15 if you
At
say 22?
30, about 15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, it will be a 15 minutes break. We'll resume at 22:04.
Thank you,
We
Chair.
adjourn.
We have cleared your table, Chair, of all files. And
Yes.
as a previous witness, this witness will present his evidence by way of slides. We have prepared the Chair a copy, which we beg to hand in. And Chair, we have taken the liberty of marking that one Exhibit B 8B. And Chair, it has the same problem as the previous. The 8 is very close to the B, and they shall all be corrected at the same time.
Okay.
Then the witnesses.
File that has been handed up now, dealing with Origin 1064 review of estimated total cost of 38.6 billion rand, evaluation of 15.6 billion rand increase in estimated total cost will be marked Exhibit B 8B.
Thank you, Chair.
I almost said triple B because the 8 looks almost like a B.
I hastened to add our error, Chair, hoping you will not point that out, but nonetheless, yes, it shall also be corrected as with the first pack of slides.
Yes.
Chair, before we proceed, 888B is mainly in two parts. The slide 1 up to slide 32 deal with the review of the increase of the approved ETC of 38.6 billion, and that relates to the 1064. From page 33, the witness will deal with an evaluation of the increase of the 100 locomotives. And, well, it's a very brief set of slides, that one. The issues are not as significant as in the 1064. In the course of his presentation, the witness will refer to a document that is in the M&S exhibits, just one document. To avoid too many files, we have taken the liberty of extracting that document from the relevant files, and we have attached to the slides, and it will appear after the tab, written Volume 1, 4532 to 4370. With this at hand, we need not refer to any other file, Chair.
Okay, that's fine.
On that basis, may I request that the witness be sworn in?
Yes, swear in the witness.
Okay.
Please state your full names for the record.
My name is Alistair Omakuwachabi.
Do you have any objections to taking the prescribed oath?
I do not.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
I do.
Do you solemnly swear that all the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Silo, you'll have to repeat the witness's name in full.
Yes. I'll repeat the name. I don't undertake in full, Chair. I know the first name to be Alistair. A-L-L-I-S-T-E-R.
A-L-I-S-T-E-R.
One L.
One L, correct, yeah.
Surname Chabi.
Shabi, correct, yeah.
C-H-A-B-I.
B-I. B for
Beatrice,
Beatrice.
Thank you,
Yes,
Chair.
thank you, Chair.
Mr. Chabi, could you tell the Chair about yourself, insofar as your professional life and qualifications are concerned?
Okay. As I already mentioned, my name is Alistair Shabi. I am an actuary by profession. In terms of qualifications, I am a fellow of the Faculty of Actuaries. That's a United Kingdom body. I am also a chartered enterprise risk actuary, and that's a global association that grants actuarial associations across the world the right to confer designations on actuaries. the SERA designation actuary, sorry. I also hold a Master's in Business Administration from the University of, from Gibbs, sorry. And I also hold a Bachelor's in Economic Science from the University of Witwatersrand.
Thank you. And what do you currently do, and where are you employed, if at all?
Okay, so for the better part of my 12-year working career, I have been advising trustee boards on their pensions and investments, in particular formulating investment policies and strategies, and valuing pension funds along with that, opening on the solvency of those retirement funds, okay, largely for corporates. I currently, well, the bulk of my time currently, besides having worked on this project, has been taken up by the Council for Medical Schemes, which is the regulatory body for medical schemes in South Africa. I sit on the costing committee as a technical expert on that committee, assisting in evaluating financial models and developing them.
And are you attached to any firm in particular currently, and if so, what firm?
I am. All Five Holding Company. I am a founding member and an employee of the entity.
Now, you come at a time, or you appear before the chair at a time when we are considering investigations conducted by MNS into certain transactions within Transnet. Can you inform the chair what role you played in that regard and how you came to be involved?
So in May of 2018, MNS, Edison Globe and City Media Attorneys approached our entity, All Five Holding Company, to assist it with the financial aspects of the acquisition of the 1064 locomotives.
And it's correct that the company then appointed you to lead the team to undertake the work?
Indeed.
You deal with the mandate you received from MNS in your slides.
Agreed.
So if we could then turn to your second slide, page 2 of your slides. And then you can take the chair through the mandate that you had received from MNS in this regard.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So as we have it overhead, essentially when MNS approached us in May of 2018, they wanted assistance with the aspects involving the 1064 acquisition, and they were investigating alleged irregularities within the acquisition of the 1064 locomotives. And what they'd asked us to do at the time was to assess, basically analyze the financial model back in the business case that led to the transaction going ahead, okay, to the board approving the transaction. In particular, the evaluating whether 38.6 billion that was approved in 2013 by the board was indeed an acceptable estimated total cost for the transaction, and then thereafter to look into the reasons put forward for the increase in the estimated total cost from 38.6 billion to 54.5 billion, and give an opinion as to whether those increases are valid, and where they are not, provide an opinion as to a reasonable increase.
Okay, I see you have listed the mandate. You have broken it up into 3, 1, 2, and 3, and 3 has got 3 further subsections. Do you propose to deal with each in turn?
I do, Advocate. So the presentation is structured in 3 parts. The first part deals with the assumptions on the identified variables, okay, assessing whether those assumptions were indeed reasonable. The second part of the presentation looks at the 38.6 billion, so in other words, the accuracy of that ETC. The last part looks into the increase, the plausibility of those reasons put forward for the increase, and our opinion on what a reasonable increase should have been at the time.
Okay, when you're ready, then you may take us through the first issue.
Okay.
The reasonability of variables and assumptions.
Assumptions.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Advocate. So the approach we have taken is we lay out the mandate, we lay out the finding, and then we go into detail on the methodology taken to arrive at the finding. So starting with the first, which is the review of the business case, in other words, looking at the variables and assumptions around those variables and determining whether they were reasonable at the time. We concluded that the assumptions in relation to those variables were reasonable, and we will touch on why we felt that they were reasonable when we reviewed.
And for that, you'd like us to turn over to slide 4.
look at the slide number here, slide 4 indeed.
I use the page numbering as a slide numbering.
Okay.
If that's okay with you.
So I'm still on slide 3, but
Yes.
we will carry on with slide 4.
Whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, Advocate. So we felt it important before getting into the variables and assumptions to explain to you, Chair, how the model actually worked. Okay, in other words, how the revenue was projected, how the costs were projected, what the profitability was around the project at the time, and then, of course, conclude with the assumptions backing those projections. Okay. Now, two measures in particular were used in the business case in actually arriving at, in upraising the business case. Okay, and those are the net present value and estimated total cost. Now, at the risk of stating the obvious, Chair, I think I will take the time to explain what the net present value is in this instance. It essentially represents the expected profit in current money terms, and that would have been 18 April 2013 at the time. And if that was positive, of course, the project would go ahead if it met the requirements of the board at the time. So you would, of course, discount your revenue to current terms, discount your cost to current terms, take the difference of the two, and if that was a positive figure, then the project would be deemed viable. The estimated total cost, on the other hand, is a very simple summation of the cost of acquiring the locomotives in the various years. We will look at the delivery schedule in a bit, and that was over a 7-year period starting 2013 to 2019. We'll touch on that in a short while. But going back to the net present value modeling, that was over a 39-year period. And I bring this up because it will become relevant when we look at the memorandum in a bit more detail later on later slides.
Okay.
Now, moving on to slide 5. How was the revenue modeled at the time in the business case? Essentially, the revenue was a tariff per ton per kilometer. Okay. So revenue is essentially taken as the product of the volume to be transported by these wagons, okay, by these locomotives at the time, and the average distance to be traveled over the year by the tariff. Okay, and that was over a 39-year period, okay, from 2013 all the way to 2049, thereabouts. Okay. You had a number of costs in this instance. You had locomotive costs, you had wagon costs, infrastructure costs, and so forth. Your ETC actually sits within the locomotive cost. So your ETC, which your estimated total cost, is actually a part of the locomotive cost. And I think we'll look a bit later at what component or what percentage your ETC made of the first bullet there. The first bullet is actually the total cost of ownership of the locomotive. In other words, everything relating to the operation of that locomotive, the direct costs relating to the operation of the locomotive. Yes. Again, those include personnel, maintenance, insurance. Emission costs were also included in that. Okay.
Okay.
We then look at the net present value, and we've already touched on the revenue and on the cost components. Okay. What you see there basically is what the present value of your costs were at the time, what the present value of your revenue was at the time. The revenue was 109 billion. You can see the net present value, which is the expected profit in current money terms, which was as at 18 April 2013, was just about 2.5% of your revenue. That's a very thin margin, to say the least. Your costs were in the region of 107 odd billion rands. Okay, and as I already mentioned, your ETC forms part of your total cost of ownership. As you can see, that there's diesel TCO and then there's electric TCO. TCO standing for total cost of ownership. Okay, and the ETC made up just over 47% of those costs.
Yes.
Okay. Present value in that you're looking at about 20 billion. So your ETC in April 2013 was about 20 odd billion rands. I know we talk of 38.6 billion, but as I said, the ETC of 38.6 billion is just a summation over the 7-year period. When you discount that using that hurdle rate that you see there of 18.56%, you get about 20 odd billion. Of the total cost, your ETC made up about 20% of your total costs. Okay, so in the grander scheme of things, it was a very a small part of your overall costs.
And the net present value calculated 2.7 billion as calculated on the basis of a hurdle rate of 18.56. Firstly, If you could just remind us what the hurdle rate is, and secondly, why you used 18.56.
Okay, so this is not what I used. This is what was employed
What was used, yes.
in the business case.
Absolutely.
And everything that you see here is actually taken from the business case.
Indeed.
Okay, that was put together for the board at the time. Now, the hurdle rate is essentially what your shareholders, generally what shareholders would want from a project before they go ahead with investment. We talk hurdle rate, we talk discount rate. The discount rate is, by definition, quite different to what you would, to the hurdle rate, in the sense that your discount rate is what you would essentially value the project at. It reflects the risks inherent in the project. Okay, whereas your hurdle rate is essentially what the shareholders want before they can go ahead with the project. Your hurdle rate would obviously be slightly more than your weighted average cost of capital, and what that is essentially what it costs the entity to what the capital costs the entity within the entity. I mean, within the organization. You would obviously have equity, you'd obviously have debt, okay? The weighted average of those two would give you the weighted average cost of capital. Your hurdle rate would sit slightly above that to, of course, account for the cost of that capital. 18.56 was used in the business case as a reflection of the risk inherent in this particular project. Okay, there's a policy, of course, that backs this number up. Very detailed process in actually arriving at this this discount rate. Okay, a lot of research. It's actually an evidence-based approach that was taken to arrive at this discount rate of 18.56. Okay. It is one of the variables we have looked at, and we felt it was reasonable, given that this project was a greenfield project. Greenfield meaning it's something that Transnet was undertaking for the first time. It had no history of having undertaken such a project in time past. Okay, so discount of 18.56 was deemed appropriate.
At the time.
At the time.
So the hurdle rate of 18.56 is prescribed by the policy.
It is prescribed by the policy, yes.
And all the drafters of the business case had to do in determining the NPV is to go to the policy, see what the applicable hurdle rate was at the time, and apply to the calculations in order to arrive at a correct, or at an actual net present value.
Indeed, correct.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Now, the next slide basically tries to show you, Chair, what the impact is on the net present value as you change the discount rate, which happens to be the hurdle rate here. And you can see that net present value actually increases as the discount rate decreases. As I've already mentioned, the discount rate is a reflection of the risk inherent within the project. So the sensitivity analysis that you have here shows that dropping the discount rate from 18.6% to 12.6% increases your profit from 2.7 billion, your net present value, sorry, to 34 billion. That's a huge increase. Just as a side note there, the 12.6 was actually the weighted average cost of capital for Transnet. Now we have there what is called the internal rate of return. It's essentially what the project was expected at the time to give you over the investment term, which was 39 years in this instant, and that was 19.6%. And we've already spoken about how thin that profit margin was. It was sitting at, it's set at 2.5%, very thin. And if you look at that internal rate of return, it is not too far from the risk discount rate. And bear in mind, the risk discount rate is a reflection of the risk inherent within that project. So if the risk had to increase slightly, this project could easily go from a profit position to a loss-making position.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that is essentially the business case as I have presented to you there. It's a very, very high-level summary of what would have been put forward to the board at the time. Now, we now look at some of the variables and assumptions around those variables. And what we looked at was the inflation assumption used in the modeling. We've actually just pulled up the key variables we thought are worth discussing, given that the context is, well, we're talking about escalations and Forex. Okay, so we restricted what we're discussing here to economic, financial variables as opposed to the engineering aspects, yes. 1064 locomotive and so forth. Now, starting with the assumption that was used for SA inflation, PPI was used, and I guess the question that would come up is, was PPI the right index to use? You're looking at locomotives, you're looking at the manufacturing sector. Producer price inflation would ideally be the right index to use and not the consumer price inflation, which is a different index to the producer price inflation. Now, what was assumed in the business case for PPI was a rate of 5.3 all the way to 5.9%. Okay, we were pretty happy with that, given where inflation was in the past, and going forward what the Reserve Bank tries to target in terms of inflation. The upper bound is 6%. So an assumption pretty close to that for us we felt was pretty reasonable. Okay, foreign currency, we'll talk about that in a bit. The hurdle rate, we have spoken about it. It was a 6% margin over the weighted average cost of capital, and we have mentioned as well that it was evidence-based. The approach taken to arrive at 18.56 was an evidence-based approach. Okay, so a lot of work went into arriving at that rate, including researching over 160 companies across the globe.
Okay. And you conclude on that the hurdle rate used of 18.6 was reasonable in the circumstances?
It was reasonable.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, when we compare the U.S., what they assume, so SAPPI was, of course, for the local content inflation. There was a foreign content or a foreign component to the locomotives, and you had to allow for inflation on that side as well, on that part. And what was assumed in the business case was CPI, the Consumer Price Index, as opposed to the Producer Price Index. We felt, well, the Producer Price Index would have been more appropriate. However, they've assumed a Consumer Price Index. What we have put before you there is the correlation between US CPI and US PPI, and you can see they're highly correlated, and positively so. In fact, when you look at the long-term average for US CPI and US PPI, the difference is about 0.27% on a yearly basis, 3.26 versus 3.01. We felt using CPI as opposed to PPI was therefore more conservative, being a higher figure. Okay. That, of course, would have the impact of reducing your net present value, but then, of course, erring on the side of caution. So we were pretty comfortable with that.
So then use of PPI would actually have given better results.
If you had used PPI, correct, because you'd have used a lower rate of inflation or escalation. It's termed escalation here, but those
so
words
the use
are
of CPI
synonymous.
reflects a conservative approach.
It did.
Okay.
It did, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. We thought it would be important to show the impact of the local content assumptions employed in the model, given that it's quite a contentious issue, still is actually. What was assumed in the model was a 50% local content assumption and a 50% foreign content assumption. We do know that at some point, National Treasury came out with a note stating that for diesels, you had to have a local content of 55% at a minimum, and for electrics of 60% at a minimum. Mm-hmm. However, what wasn't in the business case at the time, and my understanding from the legal expert is that the note was not out at the time.
Okay.
However, what was the impact of that? Was it material enough to invalidate the business case? So what we show you there is that an increase from 50% to 60% for the local content component would have resulted in a slight drop in your ETC. As you can see, they're from 38.6 billion to 38.555. I think that's about negative 0.12%. The NPV would have increased slightly, as you would expect from a drop in ETC.
Yes.
Your costs drop, your expected profits increase, would have increased from 2.739 billion to 2.75 billion, and that's a 0.4% increase. You can see that the assumption was conservative in this instance, therefore acceptable, and the difference is negligible in our view. Okay. So we accepted it, and especially given that it doesn't invalidate the business case.
Okay.
Okay. So at a very high level check, those are the assumptions that we thought would be important to bring to the fore and discuss with you.
Yes.
So up to this point, you do not take any serious issue with the assumptions and variables used for the business case?
No, we don't take any issue with
You deem
those.
them reasonable?
Correct.
Then we can go to the second item of your opinion.
Okay, so we now move to the second part of the presentation, which looks at the estimated total cost of 38.6 billion. The mandate here was essentially to determine whether this amount was an acceptable estimated total cost. In addition to that, to address the contentious issue of whether that ETC included forex hedging and whether it included escalations.
Yes.
The finding on that was the 30.6 billion wasn't acceptable, ETC.
You say was or wasn't?
Was an acceptable
Yes.
ETC, sorry. And it did indeed include forex hedging and escalation, which we will try to demonstrate a little further down
Okay.
as we continue.
Right?
So that was essentially the original delivery schedule, as you see there. We've spoken about already. So 465 diesel locomotives were predicated and 599 electric. And as you can see, the schedule there shows 100 for each year starting 2014 to 2017, and then 65 in the last year. That's what the business case modeled the delivery on. And for electrics, starting off with 65 in 2015, 130 in between, and ending off with 144 in 2019. 7 year, because it started in 2013 and ended in 2019. Now, the first delivery for diesels, as per the business case, would have been in April 2013.
Yes.
Okay, but allowing for a 4-month testing period, that means your locomotive will start operating around about August, I think
Yes.
August 2013. And that's when you start to generate revenue, essentially. For your electric locomotives, delivery would have started in April 2014. Okay, same testing period of 4 months, meaning you start generating revenue from electric locomotives in August 2014. Now, at some point we felt that 4 months was a little, well, not us, but the engineers we worked with at the time, felt that 4 months was a little too short a period for testing. They felt that an average was about 9 months. We did not have an issue with that particular assumption being made in the business case. Again, why? Because it was conservative. You're essentially bringing your costs forward and lowering your net present value, so we're okay with it. If it had been a testing period of 15 months, let's say, that would have been concerning. Okay.
Okay.
So what we show you there basically is the breakdown of that 38.6 billion in ETC. It's split by diesels and electric. You can see the total of 38.6, with the bulk of that ETC coming from the electric locomotives. Naturally so, because you had more electric locomotives and the price for electric locomotives was a lot higher than that of diesel. As a matter of fact, the cheapest electric locomotive was more expensive than the most expensive diesel locomotive. Hence that significant
The difference there.
difference between the two. We've broken it down into escalation costs, as we've already mentioned. It's escalation here is essentially inflation. So on the South African side, you had PPI. On the foreign side, you had CPI, in particular US, because the business case actually was modeled on US dollar locomotives, well, US dollar price locomotives. And contingencies also make up part of the ETC, as you can see there, roughly at about 6.1% of your total costs, okay, 2.2 billion.
So when we look at the extreme right column total, we get the 38.6 billion. That is the total cost of acquisition of both diesels and electrics.
It is.
And do we understand your slide to mean the 38.6 billion is made up of the 5 components listed above, which at a very simplistic level can be broken down into the cost of acquiring the cost of the locomotive itself at 30 billion, the escalation costs based on the PPI and the CPI, so they are factored in at 1.8 and 713.
Correct. Okay.
And these inflation costs are over a period of 7 years.
They are over a period of 7 years.
Is it hot, Mr. Chair? Are you feeling hot?
I'm still trying to calm the nerves down, Chair.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, Chair. And that is then followed by the hedging costs of 3.3 billion.
Correct.
And equally so, the hedging is over a 7-year period.
It is. Over the delivery period, which was 7 years.
Yes. And you have contingencies at 2.2 billion, and that is just a function of a percentage of
the total
the
cost of the
total-
cost you see above.
Exactly.
So 6% of the cost you see above, roughly 8% of the locomotive costs.
and that gives us 38.6 billion.
It does.
So if we say that the board approved an ETC of 38.6 billion on the basis of this slide, that 38.6 billion included both escalation and hedging, over a period of 7 years.
He did, yes.
Thank you.
I suppose it's not enough to show on a slide that these costs are included. So we thought it important to actually demonstrate that. Okay.
Please do.
If the chair will allow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
And just to explain, in order to do that, you have to get out of your slides and go into your Excel.
Into the model itself,
Yes.
yes. So it's quite a diesel model. It's taking time to upload.
Okay. While it uploads, could you at least give us a sense of what you expect when it comes up?
Okay. So what you will see before you, Chair, is the model that was used to back the business case. It's a 49-sheet model, very, very detailed. A number of different aspects were modeled there, including the MDS, the market demand strategy, in terms of the volumes that they were targeting at the time. We will, however, focus on 2 sheets in this instance, and that's the sheet that's actually labeled the Transnet hedged curve, hedge rate curve, as well as the main control input sheet. Now, the main control input sheet, it's not showing, sorry.
Is it coming up?
I think I'll need, can you see it there?
No, your computer is connected because I can see your screen. What is not
Okay.
coming up is the actual worksheets
actual-
that you want to work to demonstrate on.
Duplicate, huh?
Okay,
Sorry.
yes.
Apologies. So this was actually the model used at the time. It's Transnet's model. It's not one that we developed.
Okay,
Okay, so as mentioned, we'll look at two sheets in particular. That's the main control sheet, which is where your 30.6 billion REN output
yes.
is situated. As you can see, that's what you have right there. It's a bit,
Can you enlarge it a bit,
I'm
perhaps?
trying to enlarge that.
And you perhaps might want to use your pointer to direct us.
Okay. On the screen, okay.
Okay.
So there's your 38.6 billion there. Your net present value sits right beneath that at 2.7 billion, as you can see. Now, what you would expect, of course, is when you look at the FX curve, as you change the FX curve assumptions, you should be able to see the 30.6 billion rand changing because the sheets are interlinked.
And with the FX curve, do you mean the Forex curve?
The Forex curve,
Thank
the
you.
foreign currency.
The language must be that of lawyers to the extent possible. Thank you.
Pleasure, Advocate. Okay. So, Chair, what you have there, essentially, that sequence of numbers is what is called the FX curve. So, essentially, it's what you expect to purchase each dollar at in the future. And as you can see, as at 18 April 2013, the spot rate was 9.1285. Exactly a year after that, you would have expected to purchase the dollar at 9.5854, as you can see there. 2014, 2015 at 10 rands to the dollar, okay, 10.04, 10.5, and so forth. And so you can see that curve is actually an increasing curve. So you expect the rand to depreciate over time. And essentially that's where the cost actually comes in. Your cost is essentially the difference between your forward rate and your current rate. So in other words, it's not that different to inflation in this instance. Okay. Now, as mentioned, Chair, if you change any of these numbers here, you should be able to see a change on the 38.6 billion. So I'll give it to the Chair. I'll let you decide which number you want to change and what you want to change it to.
I think I'm trying to understand the principles.
The principle behind it.
Rather than the actual figures.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think the principle is you make an estimate of what for example, rand-dollar exchange is likely to be in 2 years' time, 3 years' time,
and so forth,
and
each year
then
going forward.
You work around your price on that basis. Is
So,
that right?
correct. So essentially, you're modeling your price,
Yeah.
your dollar price on that curve. So in other words, to get the
Yes.
price in 3 years' time, you get the
Yes.
forward rate in 3 years' time, plus what you
Yes.
expect to
Yes.
incur as an expense in 3 years' time in dollar terms,
Yes.
until you get the rent value.
With an appreciation that your estimate may be wrong, may ultimately be wrong.
Well, maybe then I should explain what forex hedging is in this instance.
Yeah, okay.
So essentially, it's an agreement between you and
That's the
that's the rate you're going to
the
buy
estimate you will use.
well, not an estimate.
Yeah.
It's actually the amount at which you're going to buy the rand, the
Yes.
dollar in the future.
Okay.
So you
Okay.
agree with the party, and that's what hedging essentially is.
Yes,
If you look at
yes.
Transnet's policy on hedging, it actually does say the objective is to eliminate the currency risk.
Oh, okay.
So essentially, Transnet wants to be certain today
Yes,
what
yes.
it will have to pay in rand terms in the future, be it a year, 2 years, 3 years, and so forth.
So as not to have any uncertainty.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
It's very different from a forecast. The
Yes.
forecast would be an estimate.
Yes.
Different entities, different
Yeah.
bodies, I mean, the World Bank, the IMF would give you
Yes.
what is
Yes.
essentially a forecast. But in this instance,
Yes. Okay. No, that's fine.
Thank you, Chair. On that basis, I will change a figure and let's see what happens. I'm good at guessing figures. Try 12.2.
For which year, advocate?
Make your pick, sir.
Okay. That's an increase, that's you expect the price.
Yes. And the idea, you wanted to demonstrate to us how that exchange rate, the anticipated exchange rate, if it changes, how it impacts the 38.6 billion approved ETC.
Correct.
So, and you had asked the chair for a figure, I'm offering you one.
Okay, so I'll use 12, and I'll use that in year 2015, tax year
Okay.
2016. Now, if we go back, to the main control sheet,
Yes.
you can see there, it's actually gone up to 39 billion.
Just zoom into your screen again. That estimated CAPEX of 39.152.
Correct.
Originally, before you tempered with the number and introduced my 12, that stood at 38.6.
Correct. And now it's gone up to 39 billion, obviously, because your rand, you expect your rand to depreciate by more than projected on the curve.
Okay. So, and the same principle would apply throughout the 7-year period. Should we begin, those numbers begin to change, this ETC will automatically change.
It will.
In line with the changes that are effected on that Forex fluctuation.
Correct. So it's quite an internally consistent model. As you can see, the NPV also changed in this instance. It came down. So your cost went up, your profitability, your profit position actually worsened. It came down to 2.5 billion. So we can do this with any number, and you will see the difference. You reduce that rate going forward, you can expect the price to also come down from 38 billion to a different figure, and the NPV to increase.
Okay.
I'll now go back to the presentation, Advocate.
Absolutely. And we were at your page 13, when you made that, you had that demonstration for us.
Correct.
Thanks. Okay.
Okay, Chair. So it's not enough to show that because a change in those rates results in the change in ETC, that you essentially had hedging included in there. It essentially tells us that those numbers were numbers going forward that had an impact on the price. The argument could be, well, all well and good, you have those numbers, but are they hedged rates? Okay, so what we then did is we approached a number of entities. We pulled out the Forex forward curve from a terminal called Bloomberg, okay, and that's accessible to, it's an international portal that's accessible to banks, asset managers, any entity. It is the formula used to determine what the forward curve is on any currency is objective. So it does not matter where you are in the world. If you want to get a forward curve at a particular point in time for the rand against the dollar, it will be the same regardless of where you pull it in the world and who pulls it out. Okay. So it is quite an objective number. We approached a few banks as well to understand what they would charge to actually offer that guarantee to anybody willing to enter into an agreement on the currency. And this is essentially what we got. So what you have on that slide essentially is what Transnet used in its modeling at the time and what we obtained from the market at the time. So as at 18 April 2013, on the day, if you had to go and hedge all these cash flows from the business case, that's what the market would have given to you at. And you can see there's actually not much difference between the two, 9.59, 9.59 in 2014, 10.04, 10.05 in 2015. So you'd expect price differences depending on who actually gives you, gets into the contract with you, 10.52 compared to 10.53 and so forth. The biggest variance comes in 2020 at 12.55 compared to 12.42. However, let's remember that the delivery schedule stopped in 2019. So the 2020 forward rate had no impact on the business case.
And now if we look at your graph and we look at the blue, starting from 2014 right through to 2020, the numbers indicated in respect of each, do those correspond with the numbers you showed us on the Excel, which you said was the workbook for the computation of the 38.6 billion?
Yes, they do. We can go back and check that.
Okay. So you extracted those numbers, put them on a chart, and then you introduced the red or pink columns, whatever the color may be, which are the figures you obtained from Bloomberg.
Correct.
And you are comparing on an annual basis, and you reach a conclusion that the difference in any given year is insignificant.
Indeed.
And what must the chair draw from that exercise?
That the 38.6 billion included hedging, and we have demonstrated that the figures here were actually forward curve, foreign currency hedged rates.
And the chair had asked whether it will not be said there were mere estimates. Does this help clarify the issue in any manner?
Well, what we have following that essentially is what we've just looked at on the spreadsheet, which were the rates Transnet used at the time for the currency hedge. In the same spreadsheet, okay, one of the 49 sheets has forecast rates, and those are used to model maintenance costs, and just maintenance costs in the model. And that's what you have there, and they were obtained from Global Insight. You can see there's quite a marked difference between the hedged rate and the forecast rate. Okay, so 9.59 compared to 8.62, 10.04 compared to 8.89, and so forth all the way. In fact, that variance increases as you go out into the years.
And so slide 15, the red indications are the forecast rates.
Forecasted rates, yes.
The blue is the hedged rates.
Yeah.
And what we should understand from this slide is Transnet, from your analysis, Transnet in the development of the business case used the actual hedge rates, not the forecast rates.
And we've actually seen that because as we changed the rates, the hedge rates, we saw a change in the ETC.
So then, addressing the question of hedging, Transnet used the correct figures to work out the Forex curve.
It did.
Okay.
So there is no doubt foreign currency was included. I guess the argument would have then been, were those foreign currency assumptions going forward hedged rates or mere assumptions, mere forecasts. And I think we have demonstrated that they were not mere forecasts, they were hedged rates.
Okay. Thank you. May proceed.
We now deal with the escalation bit. I think there was also a question, not that I think I know, there was a question around whether escalation costs were included. We can, the same way we've demonstrated with the foreign currency hedge, show that escalation was also included.
So then if we go back to your slide 6, sorry, not 6, apologies. I'm looking for slide 13. 13, please, yes. So when slide 13 provides for hedging costs, forex hedging costs at 3.3 billion, these are real and properly hedged for hedging costs
Indeed.
of the forex.
Yes.
And equally so, you suggest when we do a similar exercise for escalation, and we look at the figures appearing as against SAPPI and US CPI of 1.8 billion and 713 million respectively, that those two are properly calculated, they are real escalation rates, and it's just not mere guesswork,
It isn't,
if
yes.
I can put it that way.
So the assumption of local PPI, as already mentioned, was in the region of 5.5%, okay, 5.3 going to 5.9%, and on the US side was 2.3% going into the future.
Okay. Then on that understanding, you may proceed with escalation costs at slide 16, that's where we were.
Okay, so I'm not sure if you want me to actually go and demonstrate this. I could. Okay. Your assistance again in this regard. So. Okay, should come up. Yeah. All right, I'll just reset that and get it back to 38.6 billion.
Which means you must go correct my 12.
Indeed. Okay, so there we are. We're back to the original assumptions. What we will then look at here now is the main control input sheet and the sheet in which the cost of the diesel and electric locomotives were computed.
Yes.
And that's under total cost of ownership locals, capital expenditure.
Yes.
As we go down, you can see the forward rates appearing there as well, going forward, as you can see. What you have beneath that are your PPI and CPI, SAPPI and US CPI assumptions.
You might want to enlarge your screen a bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
There we go. Shall we try a figure advocate?
No, I know it works. I know the system works. I'm
Okay.
satisfied. So from that worksheet, you seek to demonstrate that both the SAPPI and US inflation were taken into account, once again, over the period of 7 years.
Correct.
And that it is, and those were the actual rates of inflation anticipated, what?
Expected at the time.
Expected rates
Yes.
of inflation going forward.
Going forward.
They are then factored into the calculation and they give us certain numbers, which we then reflect on our page 13 under both inflations.
Correct.
And this is to demonstrate that they are taken into consideration in the computation of the 38.6 billion.
Correct. So essentially, if you had to change those numbers, you should see a change in your 38.6 billion.
Once again, as we did with the Forex.
With the Forex, yes.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, we may proceed.
With a demonstration or, okay. I will pick a number. I'll just zero-rise the first and zero-rise the second.
Okay.
So we're expecting no inflation in 2014 and 2015.
Mm.
If you go to the main control input sheet, you can see your costs have actually changed there.
It's gone up to 37.
It's actually changed to 37.269 billion.
Okay.
Zero-rised.
Yeah.
Remember here, I'm sure you're actually asking yourself, why is it going down and not up?
You are a mind reader, Mr. Chabi?
Okay, all right. So if you have a local content component and then a foreign component, in this instance, your cost of hedging would have gone up and so would your foreign inflation in this instance. So as you can see, there's actually change as a result.
And if we retained then the percentages as we had and we changed in the second row, what would happen then? Okay. Would that ETC go up or down? What should we expect?
Okay. So just a second, Advocate. It actually comes on slide to 38.008 billion.
Goes up again.
No, it comes down. 38 comes down to
From 38.6
6 billion.
So
comes
now,
down to
yeah,
38
of course,
billion.
of
Correct.
course.
And your NPV goes up.
Okay.
So those costs were allowed for.
Okay.
within the
So
model.
and the NPV has changed now from 2.7 billion to 2.9.
Correct.
Okay. I think the demonstration is clear, at least for me. We may proceed. Okay.
Okay. So, Chair, we have seen escalation was included, okay, not just on the local side, but also on the foreign side. And we've just demonstrated that you change the figures, the numbers as well change as a result.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we know why. If you zeroize it, it actually comes down because you're assuming there's no inflation going forward.
Yes.
The same way if you had increased the inflation amount, it would have gone up in cost. Hence
we
the
saw
drop
it
from
happen.
3.6 billion to the figures that we had seen.
Okay.
Okay, so in concluding that, as I've already mentioned, escalation was included, Forex was included, and the 3.6 billion was a reasonable and acceptable estimate of the total cost of acquiring the locomotives at the time.
Inclusive of escalation and Forex.
And Forex hedging, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, Chair, so the next part of the presentation takes us to the increase in the ETC from 38.6 billion to 54.5 billion, the 15.9 billion spoken of. And our mandate there, of course, was to determine whether that 15.9 billion was a reasonable increase in the ETC or not. The format here is slightly different because of the, well, we could not put the opinion up front and then give the detail later because looking at the three aspects following, they are interlinked. So what we will do is we'll then turn to the memorandum, okay, and take you through that.
And for the record, if your BB8B has got a tab. I won't give it a color because the colors may differ. But what's written on the tab is volume 1, 4352 to 4370. Chair, it is in BBHB.
here?
Yes, it's the document after the tab.
On what page?
The chair's bundle
On
has
this?
got a tab like that. Yeah, yours is green.
Yeah, okay.
And the green tab is marked volume 1, 4352 to 4370.
Yes.
That is the memo that Mr. Chabi would like us to consider.
Correct.
And what's written on the tab is just for reference purposes where that document was extracted from in the record. This is just for ease of
Is that a
reference.
document that was supposed to be here, or? Because there's volume 1, 4352 to 4370,
Yes, Chair.
and then after that there is part C, and then there is a document which is.
Yes.
Hmm?
Then thereafter,
That's the next document.
then it's a
That's the one you're
Transnet
talking
document, yes, headed memorandum. That's the correct document, Chair. If I may just confirm, it
Oh,
has at the
yes.
top, yes, Chair.
Yeah, okay, headed memorandum
Yes, Chair.
to Transport Board of Directors from Brian Molefe.
Indeed.
Okay.
That's the document you'd like us to have regard to now.
Correct.
Okay?
Thanks, Alvin.
We're at that document.
Okay. So, just to highlight what our mandate here was, I think in the words of the chairman from M&S, his words were, we want you to deconstruct the memorandum and look at every component cost and tell us if each of those costs make sense. And if where they don't, give us what you think is a reasonable cost. Okay. Now, this was a memo, of course, presented to the board on the 23rd of May 2014 by the then GCE, Group Chief Executive of Transnet,
Yes.
justifying the increase in ETC. What you have before you, under the executive summary, bullet point number 2, are the reasons he puts forward for the increase in ETC.
Before you do that, for the record, at 4353, the document states the purpose of the document, and it states as follows. The purpose of this memo is, firstly, for the BOD to note the reasons for the increase in ETC, B, to request that the BOD approve an increase in the estimated total cost, ETC, for the acquisition of 1064 locomotives for the general freight business of Transnet Freight Rail from 38.6 billion to 54.5 billion. And before you deal with the content, I will then refer us to the last page of that document, which would be at 4370, and it is signed by Mr. Anuj Singh, recommended by Mr. Anuj Singh, recommended by Mr. Siabonga Gama, and recommended by Mr. Brian Molefe, signing Mr. Molefe on the 14th of May, no, on the 23rd of May, 2014, Mr. Gama on the 21st of May, 2014, and Mr. Singh on the 22nd of May, 2014. So that's when the memo was generated, and I have stated its purpose. You now wanted to deal with the executive summary, so you may proceed.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, so what I've put before you are the reasons, essentially table 2 on the slide. What you have in red, of course, are the memo values, and what you have in blue are the recalculated values. So let me just explain each of those reasons that he puts forward in the memo. So there's an update for the business case, of the business case for updated economic factors. That's how it reads, update of business case for updated economic factors. Now, we will understand what that means essentially when we get to table 2, where he starts off with the locomotive price, but essentially it's a backward-looking adjustment for inflation and the depreciation in the rand, okay, from March 2014 going back to what he terms the close of tender date, okay, which we believe to be 30 April 2013. In certain instances, it goes back 2 years, whereas it should have gone back 1 year. But we'll touch on the actual numbers a bit later. 5.4 billion compared to 4.4 billion, so we felt it was a 1 billion rand overestimation in that regard. He then talks about risk mitigation, and that's for forex and inflation going forward. Okay, and he pegs that at 9.5 billion. We have come to a cost of 6.2 billion over that period. Okay, that's allowing for the foreign currency hedging going forward, as well as the escalation going forward. A Transnet engineering scope is also introduced in the increase. Now, in the business case, no allowance was made for TE scope. There was, however, as you would have noticed on the slides, a 2% localization premium. We have asked the engineers what that was for, and the financial team what that was for, and they said it had nothing to do with TE scope. It was an assumption around the premium you would have expected to pay if you had to obtain certain services locally. He talks about contingencies as well, pegs that at 10% of the total cost, which was 49.5 billion. In fact, adding the 4.95 billion to the 49.5, you get the 54.5 billion. And then if you look at the table on the memorandum, it's actually not showing there. The last entry is lower capital acquisition cost of the locomotive obtained through the competitive tender and negotiation process led to the best price adjustment of 2.7 billion, and he claims a 6.5 billion rent saving. We will speak to that as well a bit later.
Yes.
Okay. But essentially, we felt that the contingencies were quite high, 4.95 billion. We pegged it at 2.8 billion. We will get into that shortly. The batch pricing at 2.7 billion, we felt it was a cost that was not reasonable, and we pegged that at 0. As you can see there. Following that, we have in that slide 20, a more detailed breakdown of those risks, of those reasons put forward. Now, the update of the business case for updated economic factors. Sorry, what you haven't read, Chair, are what we took exception to, and what you have in blue is what we're comfortable with. Okay, so we were not comfortable with the escalation from the tender closing close date all the way to March 2014. We're also not comfortable with the best price adjustment. We've just spoken to that. And the cost to fix escalation going forward, we weren't comfortable with those costs either. But just to tie in what you're seeing on this slide to the table on the executive summary under bullet point number 2 that we've just spoken to. So your update.
Sorry, Mr. Chabi, before we go into the detail, you have listed there the various elements, and except for the buffer, after each you have denoted with alphabet in brackets.
Correct.
So help us understand
what those are. Okay,
the logic. Yeah.
Sure, Advocate. So the buffer is there. It's the first bullet,
Yes.
best and final offer prices.
Yes.
Okay. This essentially, if you turn to table 2 in the memo.
And that, Chair, will be at that bundle, page 48. For the moment, please ignore the reference bundle, just the bundle number. Please use the bold double-digit page numbering. It is for purposes of this. Now at 48, that's table 2. However, we do acknowledge that it's completely unreadable, Chair. If you go over leaf, we have reproduced it and printed on landscape, hoping that it will become more readable. Yes. We are there, Mr. Chabi.
Thank you. So the alphabets simply mirror what the GCE put in the memo. And you can see from that table that he labels escalation up to signature date, which is March 2014, as A. The original TE as B. You will see B appearing there twice on the slide and in the memo. Okay, and those two relate to Transnet's engineering scope.
Yes.
We carry down all the way to contingencies labeled G.
Okay. So if we're looking, we wonder what C is. We know it's forex adjustment from April 2013 to March 2014. And it will be listed as such in our page 48 and the table 2.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Because it's for ease of reference when you look at table 2.
Now, secondly, before we unpack the detail, you have some listed in red and some in blue, not black, blue.
In blue.
On your slide. Can you talk us through that?
Okay. So I was still going through tying this to the reasons he put forward in the summary.
Yes, sir.
And explaining the breakdown. So as mentioned, it's a more detailed breakdown of the reasons he put. If you look at table 2, it's basically about 4 reasons borrowing the saving that's being claimed. The batch pricing is included in the last bullet there. If you update of business case for updated economic factors is essentially the backward-looking adjustment and looks at escalation from the close of tender to March 2014, and it also includes the forex adjustment from the close of tender all the way to March 2014. Okay, so that's the update that the memo is speaking to, backward-looking. Okay, so forex and escalation. Risk mitigation, the same items, the same factors, however, forward-looking. And as you can see there, it's broken down into the cost of fixed escalation to the end of the contract and the cost of hedging to the end of the contract.
Yes.
Okay. You then have TE scope, and that's just the addition of the original Transnet TE scope and the additional TE scope. It's just the sum of those two items there. And you've got hedging and you've got batch pricing, of course.
Yes.
We'll discuss this particular table a little later in the slide. What we have done on the slide to follow is we've actually put the numbers from the memo, we've juxtaposed that to our calculation and to the business case, okay, just for ease of comparison.
So what you have at slide 21, but for the numbers under business case and under assessed value, that is a reflection of table 2 of the memo,
Correct.
the May 2014 memo.
Agreed.
So in order to do a comparison, you remind us what the business case had budgeted for in respect of each item, and then you introduce the assessed value, which is the result of your calculations.
Correct.
Okay, you may then lead us through it.
Okay, thank you, Advocate. Okay, so as mentioned, we've put the numbers right next to the list that we've just discussed. Okay, and as you can see, just going back to the business case, we try to break it down just to show you how those costs actually come in. Starting with the locomotive price, you remember it was sitting at 30.476 billion when we discussed it initially on the earlier slide where we broke down the ETC of 38.6 billion.
Yes.
That, by the way, includes a 2% localization premium. So I think if you remove that, you're looking at about 29.8 billion thereabout. Now, there is no backward escalation on that. Okay, in other words, adjustment, because remember, this business case was actually developed at the time when the tenders were closed. Okay, so everything from that point is actually forward-looking. There's no backward adjustment. The prices then reflect the prices that you would have paid for locomotives at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's left blank. The original TE scope, as mentioned, the financial team that developed the model say to us that they did not allow for Transnet engineering scope in the modeling of the business case.
Yes.
Forest adjustment, however, you have in there because the rate used was the forward rate 1 year later,
Yes.
okay, assuming that you were actually going to acquire the locomotives in dollars at that forward rate and not at the spot rate of 9.1285.
Yes.
Okay, so the rate used to actually convert from US dollars to rands was 9.5854 as we looked at, as we saw earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There was no batch price adjustment in that scenario, I suppose for obvious reasons. Okay. Additional TE scope, no TE scope. However, sorry.
Before we do that, let's take batch pricing as an batch price adjustment as an example. Under business case, say it was not catered for.
It was not catered for in the
Okay.
business case.
The memo suggests that it's going to cost 2.7 billion.
Correct.
And if we look at the assessed value, which is your recalculation, you say there shouldn't be a provision for batch
For
pricing.
batch pricing, correct.
Okay.
I suppose we'll get to the
Yes, no.
detail
Just
a
we'll
bit
follow the
later.
logic of this table.
Okay. There was forward escalation, there was forward hedging. As mentioned, you are looking ahead, so everything is forward-looking, and contingencies there. We've already spoken to that 2.2 billion, and that
Okay.
made up 6% of all the costs you see before, or 8% of your locomotive costs, depending on how you want to look at it. Okay. Next to that, the memo figures, and in this instance, you can see how the GCE at the time takes us from the 29 billion all the way to 54 billion.
Yes.
Okay, you can see the numbers reflected there. The backward-looking escalation was pegged at 2.3 billion. We came to 1.3 odd billion there.
No, it won't show on your screen. Yeah, does your mouse show when you run it on the slide? No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
Okay. The numbers get to be too many, and then we easily get lost.
You easily get lost,
So
okay.
I'm trying to find a better way in which you can refer us to a specific number you want to speak to, then we can find it on the slide, then we can follow what you're saying.
Okay, so let me give the overall conclusion at this
Okay.
point, and then we'll go into the detail later.
All right.
So essentially, the 15.9 billion was a 41% increase from the business case to the memo.
Yes?
What we have come to, and we actually do say allowing for TE scope. Now, we'll discuss that later. At the time, we felt that we did not have enough information to draw a conclusion on TE scope. And MNS is still working on that, and once there's an outcome on that, we'll be able to reflect a figure here based on what they come up with.
So before you leave
So-
that point, the increase on the business case in terms of the memo suggests a 41% increase.
Correct?
That's
okay.
what you say. That 15.9 increase. Your calculation, on your calculation, you conclude that the reasonable increase from the business case scenario to date, or to the time that the approval for the increase was being sought, ought to be 6.8 billion,
Correct.
which then would reflect 18%.
An 80% increase, correct. Allowing for TE scope.
Yes, allowing for TE scope, which on your slide you have put an asterisk next to,
Agreed.
for both TE scope and additional TE scope. Now, if following in further investigations or conclusion of investigations by MNS on the TE scope, a finding is made that TE scope ought not to be costed in the manner that it is, or at all, would that have an impact on the increase that you would say is reasonable?
It would, and we show it on the next slide, and essentially that would result in an 11% increase.
As opposed to the current 18% that you
increase.
hold? So whereas now with TE, taking TE into consideration, you arrive at a 6.8 billion increase as a reasonable increase. But if you take out TE scope, both original TE and additional, the increase ought to have been 4.2 billion above 38.6.
Correct.
And that would be mathematically leading us, what, to 42?
42.8 billion.
40?
42.8 billion, rounded off.
42.8 billion,
Allowing for TE scope, that's 45.4 billion.
okay? We're with you.
The next set of slides take us into the detail of each of the items that we have put there.
Yes.
So starting with the baffle price, the base price of the locomotive, we consider that reasonable. And why did we do that? We looked at the last best and final offer prices provided by the bidders at the time, and that was as of 15 January 2014.
Okay.
Now, as you can see on the slide, CNR's baffle price at the time was 28 odd million, GE's 24.
And that's your
Sorry,
row 3.
that's
If you look
row
at the
4.
extreme left corner, at the top, at the heading, you identify each bidder. Then you have a row that shows number of locals per bidder, right?
Correct.
Then that is followed in the next row, price per local, CFET. That's the cross-functional evaluation team.
Correct.
And that is then lastly followed by price per local baffle. And that is the price you are talking to now, you are speaking to now.
Agreed.
Okay.
Now, we have included price per local CFET here just to show you what the drop was between December 2013 and January 2014 after baffle letters were sent out to each bidder to ask for the best and final offer price, requesting for the best and final offer price.
So then on that understanding, let's take CNR, indicates price per local at point of evaluation was 40.5 million per local.
Per local.
Their buffer price being their final best and final offer, it came down to 28 million,
Correct.
okay?
That's roughly 30%. A 30% discount, yeah.
And then we follow that logic in respect of all the bidders,
Correct.
okay?
So G and BT's discounts were in the region of 6%. CSR's discount was in the region of 16%. So CNR and CSR had the largest drop between December 2013 and Jan 2014, as you can see there. However, we're basing the calculation on the baffle price, which is the last price they put forward to
Okay.
the team
Now-
at the time.
Proceed.
Okay. So on that basis, we considered the number of locomotive each bidder was contracted to provide to deliver. We came to a total price of 29.5 billion.
Now, let's just find it on the slide.
Under
You
us.
have, as your last row, total. And in respect of each bidder, you have a total, starting with CNR at 6.5 billion, and work our way across. And your second last column is headed assessed value. And you have 29,532. And then the memo, you have 29,355.
Correct.
Which 29 were you speaking to now?
So the 29.532,
The 532, which is the assessed value.
the assessed value.
And that is the total of all buffers
Correct.
from CNR, GE, BT, CSR collectively.
Combined, yes.
Okay.
What you have in the memo, the starting price in the memo is 29.355 billion. Now, we took the memo value, accepted that value on the basis that the negotiation should have yielded results, because the price that we're seeing as a starting price in the memo is slightly lower than the price we arrived at the buffer stage. There were no documents to substantiate the 29.355 billion in the memo. So we accepted the price as reasonable. Also considering that the business case was in the region of 30 billion, this is a decrease from what you had assumed in the business case and what you have at the negotiation stage. So the
Okay.
starting price of 29.355 billion was a reasonable starting price in our view. Had it been higher, we would have had concerns, because then it would have meant that the negotiation did not yield the results it should have yielded.
So whereas collectively, the bidders offered a cost per local at 30 billion, the evaluation process ran its course and the negotiations, and at the end of negotiations, Transnet was able to negotiate them collectively down to a total local cost of 29.3 billion,
1.3 billion, that's 177 million rand difference.
177 million.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, we highlight this because it takes us back to Table 2 under the executive summary of the memorandum, where a saving of 6.5 billion rand was claimed for lower capital acquisition costs. Now, in all our assessment, we could not come to that figure. In fact, we have reproduced that same table there overhead. And I'll read that again. It says, lower capital acquisition costs of the locomotive obtained through the competitive tender and negotiation process yielded a saving of 6.5 billion. Now, remember, he actually mentions in the less the batch price adjustment. It is unclear why we have a less the best price adjustment, because it is one of the factors that led to the increase. So essentially, the saving being claimed is actually 9.2 billion rands.
Before you move on, then please go back to your 23. We just spoke on this slide, and if I heard you correctly, you said under at the row total under memo, the 29.3 billion that you have listed there, set out there under total, was the final negotiated position by Transnet.
Correct.
And we know from previous slides that when the bids were first evaluated, that cost was at 30 billion odd. Yeah.
29.5 billion. The 30s comes from the business case.
Okay, the business case. And you indicated to the chair that the difference between the total as per the bids and the negotiated position is 177 million.
Correct.
So if we are to talk of any savings, it's 177 million rand saving from the bid position.
Well, if you talk of savings
Per-
from lower capital acquisition
Exactly.
costs, yes.
So it's 177.
Correct.
So if you go forward to your 24, The memo suggests that there was a lower capital acquisition cost of locomotive that was obtained through the competitive tender and negotiation process, and indicates that as a 6.5 billion.
Correct.
How do I reconcile the 177 million you just spoke of now and the 6.5 billion?
I suppose you can't reconcile it.
On the worksheets you worked through, are you able to validate that 6.5 billion? Have you been able to?
Well,
From the worksheets and any other documentation provided you?
we know how the 6.5 billion was arrived at, yes. And we can demonstrate that if need be.
But my question was, is there any documentation that I can turn to that will show me a 6.5 billion savings?
Not to our knowledge.
Okay. Chair, I see it is 5 o'clock.
Yes, we are going to adjourn, but before we adjourn, I think that my ability to follow Mr. Shabi's very technical evidence
Yes,
would
sir.
have been enhanced if I had had a statement or affidavit from him telling me exactly what he would be testifying ahead of his evidence, because then I would have looked at that in advance, tried to understand it before he comes to the witness stand, rather than try to understand it while he's
As it
talking.
presents.
So, one, I think it's going to be important that you arrange, the legal team arranges, that he prepares an affidavit
Yes, Chair.
that deals with his evidence from beginning up to the end, as you would do with an expert,
I would.
because
sir.
the need to try and understand and prepare is much more greater with technical evidence than with factual
Indeed.
evidence. So I would like you to do that before we can continue and finish with him.
May I propose then, Chair,
Yeah,
accepting that,
yeah,
that we stop with it's 5 o'clock now, we are going to
yeah,
stop.
yeah,
Mr. Chabi would have returned tomorrow morning to complete his evidence.
yes.
It is absolutely critical that the Chair understands this
It's very
piece of
important,
evidence.
yeah,
And I request that we then stand Mr. Chabi down,
yeah,
we sort out a proper expert report
yeah,
to be handed in under affidavit,
yeah,
and we will recall Mr. Chabi.
yes,
He will have to go through the evidence he has led, but then I suppose then it will be quicker because the Chair would have had
It will be
opportunity to
quicker.
consider his expert report.
Yes.
And then we deal with the remainder of his evidence.
yes, yeah, no, that's.
If that would be acceptable to you,
We can do
Chair.
it that way. Mr. Shabi, I'm sorry about that, but your evidence is quite technical, and it would be much better if ahead of you coming to testify, I've read it and I've identified areas that need clarification, because in the end also we can keep you in the witness stand for a shorter time if you just come to clarify certain aspects that might need clarification.
Understood, Chair.
So Ms. Silo will liaise with you, the legal team will liaise with you for that affidavit to be prepared, and in due course we'll ask you to come back. You understand?
Thank you, Chair.
And Chair, I can confirm that approach would work. It worked for me,
Yeah.
so.
Yes, yes.
And I know nothing about figures.
But also I can just say, for the benefit of members of the legal team in regard to witnesses that may come, with every witness it's important that I have the statement ahead. I know that in this case it might have been thought that it should be fine, but I think it's critical to have that ahead of the witness, but also with other witnesses. I have already spoken to you with regard to Mr. Sedumedi's evidence.
Yes, we have
and,
communicated your
we'll
position,
make
Chair.
arrangements.
Yes, Chair.
His evidence was quite important, but of course his was not technical, so his could be followed easily, but it would be convenient to have a full statement or affidavit that covers his evidence. But certainly Mr. Chabi's one it's important to have it ahead of him giving evidence so that one can follow it after having studied the affidavit in advance.
We shall do so and reschedule, Mr. Chabi.
Yes.
If I may just point out, the next witness for tomorrow, I'm not leading Dr. Bloom, comes on Friday. I don't know what arrangements Mr. Pretorius has made, but maybe I can communicate your views to him and see if he would be ready with an affidavit by then.
He's hearing you. He hears you.
I wasn't expecting him so close next to me.
Yeah, so
But he
I'm
has
sure
me.
he will talk to me.
Yeah, the issue, though, I want then to address, Chair, is we had prepared on this basis of slides. We have the last witness tomorrow. It's not a technical witness. We are back now into the factual arena. Would request that you permit us to proceed in the same manner that Mr. Sidumedi testified, which is with slides, and it's not a big topic. And he, like Mr. Sidumedi, will subsequently then reduce all that testimony to an affidavit, which shall be filed, and then the chair will determine whether he would like to interrogate them any further.
No, that's
Thank you,
fine.
Chair.
That's fine.
But as regards Mr. Chabi, definitely will prepare an expert report.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chabi. We will leave it at that in terms of your evidence, and you have understood what the arrangement is. Thank you.
Chair.
You are excused for now. Otherwise, we are ready to adjourn. Tomorrow we start at 9.
We could start at 10. It's a 2-hour witness.
It's a 2-hour witness.
Yes, Chair.
How many more witnesses do you have for Transnet?
1, 2, 6.
6.
I'm counting. It's 5, 6, Chair.
Okay. So,
But this week too.
yes.
And then the others would come in the next week.
Okay, all right. No, that's fine then. We'll adjourn then, and tomorrow we'll start at 10. We adjourn.
Thank you, Chair.
For us,